Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Why Should I Care, the series where we unpack various works of literature with the hopes of answering the question, why should we care about them? Continuing today with Blood Meridian, Chapter 4. Now, we've also had some production value increases here at Why Should I Care. I've invested in a new microphone, so hopefully the audio is a little cleaner and easier to listen to. We've also got a new little bit of introduction music, which I arranged. It's an arrangement of the sort of Civil War time song "Poor Wayfaring Stranger," with some sort of Western flair. I picked it because I thought it was sort of quite relevant to the kid's story. So hopefully you enjoy that. But let's get into Chapter 4 of Blood Meridian. So, we left the kid at the end of Chapter 3, having just joined the army and gone out on his big night out with the lads and having his new friend killed. So, funnily enough, the death of that friend, that fellow soldier, allowed the kid to have his own horse now. So he rides out of the town with the company on the dead man's horse. Now, this is 5 days after what happened. So he's had a little time to sort of get used to the camp, get used to the military life, and they're now heading down to Mexico. But what will they find when they get there? If the Mennonite is to be believed, probably nothing good. Essentially, they ride out of the town into the desert. We get a lot of descriptions in this chapter of the landscape. Obviously, we get the sense from what the Mennonite said and sort of a lot of this book, that they're going to a place that is barren and bleak and violent. So, they sort of leave the town, they enter this landscape. On the first days, they saw no game, no birds, save buzzards. There's lots of dust around. They're able to shoot some donkeys and wild pigs to eat after a couple of days. And then they come upon a herd of antelopes. Now, the captain gets his sort of big rifle out. It's sort of described almost, I guess, like a sniper rifle. I don't know if that's anachronistic to say, but he's got a scope and he lines it up. He puts it on a tripod and he shoots a couple of these antelopes for everybody to eat at the camp. We also get a description of the kind of kit that the captain is running with. So obviously he has this sort of like sniper rifle, but he also has these two expensive revolvers that he purchased from a deserter for $80. So if we think back to the previous chapter where the kid sold his mule and got that $2.50 gold piece as change, it's quite clear that the guns that this captain has are quite expensive. And then it's quickly compared to the kit that the kid is running with. And he has this sort of old rifle that's been sawed down and rebored. It says the mold for it was so small he had to patch the balls with buckskin. It was carried before, and the forestock was much worn beneath. So we again get this sense of the disparity between what the captain has with his very expensive guns and what the kid's being given, which is a gun that's old and worn and doesn't actually shoot straight. But they continue. The antelopes that the captain shot were brought back into camp. They sort of start to chop them up, all laughing and having sort of a great time as they chop them up and prepare them to eat. I imagine this would be quite a good thing, particularly there's, I think 60 or so it says later, maybe 40 people in this company. So a pretty welcome sight to have some quality food after so long in such a barren place where there was no game. So, it's now been 6 days that they've been traveling, and they're starting to become quite ragged. This is a very hot place. What they're in, essentially, the desert. I believe at this point it's the Chihuahuan Desert. And clearly, like we said before, there's not a lot of access to food. There's not a lot of access to water. They're sort of just moping along the landscape, I guess looking for some Mexicans to rob. Following behind them, we hear of a sutler. So this is a trader that follows military companies and I guess sells them various things. We then get this extremely long sunrise description, which we get a lot of in this book. I'll read one, just because I think the imagery is super interesting. But we get a lot of this. A lot of this chapter, at least the sort of main part of this chapter, is basically an array of landscape descriptions, a lot of sky descriptions, until it sort of reaches a boiling point at the end. But we'll get to that. So McCarthy says, they rode on, and the sun in the east flushed pale streaks of light, and then a deeper run of colour like blood seeping up in sudden reaches, flaring planewise, and where the earth drained up into the sky at the edge of creation, the top of the sun rose out of nothing like the head of a great red phallus, until it cleared the unseen rim, and sat squat and pulsing and malevolent behind them. So, quite a vivid description of the sun sort of rising over these hills, and then pushing down, sort of pulsing down on them with the heat in this sort of dry desert. Again, we get a lot of this, but I thought I'd just read through that one so we can get a good sense of how effectively McCarthy sort of evokes these images. So it's been a bunch of days. They don't have a lot of food. They don't have a lot of water. It's super hot. We get this description. They rode with their heads down, faceless under their hats, like an army asleep on the march. Now, reading this sort of reminded me of some of the work of T.S. Eliot, particularly his poem The Hollow Men, which paints this sort of post-apocalyptic image of what it is like to be sort of a modern man, at least a modern man in the time of T.S. Eliot, which was the early part of the 20th century. But we get a lot of the sort of similar imagery in that poem as well. So I wonder if perhaps McCarthy was drawing on that in his depiction of these soldiers, these sort of, I guess, hollow men who are aimlessly walking in the desert to their doom. We also hear that 3 men have become sick. One of them dies, and then 2 others who are still alive are placed on the wagon. And it's a pretty grim description as they're sort of being bounced around and slamming against the wagon as they essentially die. Eventually they do die, and they're buried by the side of the road, and then the company just moves on. At this point, there's also wolves that are following them. After they sort of make camp for the night and then leave in the morning, the wolves will go into the camp and try to sort of scavenge any meat or food that they can. But they continue. It's been 10 days now. 4 men have died of the sickness, and they continue into this desert. They now arrive at an even more bleak landscape, a plain of pure pumice where there grew no shrub, no weed, far as the eye could see. The captain halts the company. He talks to... There's a member of the company who is Mexican. His name is Candelario. So he talks to this Mexican soldier. They say something. We don't get a lot of insight into what exactly they talk about, but I imagine he's asking for directions or maybe some ideas of where they should go. And then one of the soldiers says, "This looks like the high road to hell to me." So again, this sort of apocalyptic, hellish imagery that we get from these landscapes, particularly this new landscape that they've just entered, where there's no trees, there's no shrubbery, it's literally just sort of white. Pumice is a stone that I imagine sort of covers the landscape like a fine dust. We get descriptions later where the soldiers are described as elders because the white dust has sort of caked their faces and is caught up in their moustaches and their hair. So this sort of, in a sense, is the road to hell. And again, drawing back to the ideas that the Mennonite talked about and God's wrath. Is this sort of barren landscape God's wrath, or is it maybe something else that's coming that's even more dangerous than just nature? So they continue. They then come across some corpses of men and mules sort of burning and cracking in the sun. Again, it is really sort of hellish in these descriptions. We get this interesting reference to astrology here, where McCarthy says, slept with their alien hearts beating in the sand like pilgrims exhausted upon the face of the planet Anarita. So I don't know a lot about astrology. I did have to look this up. But apparently in astrology, the planet Anarita sort of signals ill fortune and, yeah, sort of suffering. Again, connecting sort of consistent sky descriptions to the experiences of the soldiers in quite an interesting way there. At this point, it's they've sort of realized that it's stinking hot all the time, so they've decided to ride at night, which I think maybe they should have done from the beginning, particularly if you're in the middle of the desert. I don't know. Obviously, these people are out of place here. We get this really big sense that they've come to a place unlike anything they're really used to. They don't really know what to do. They don't know how to survive in this place. It's almost as if the land itself is rejecting them. Maybe the land and sort of, I guess, Mother Nature has a sense that what they're doing in this place is not good and not noble. So it's punishing them with this sort of heat and emptiness. It begins to thunder. So there's lightning and thunder all in the sky, but no rain. Again, this sort of draws us back to these images of the wrath of God. Obviously, Zeus with his sort of lightning bolt. A lot of the time we get this sort of feeling of thunder and lightning from the heavens as a sort of powerful metaphor for the wrath of God. And I think that's reflected here with this sort of consistent thunder that's happening in the mountains and the clouds above them. And we get, a lot of these sort of night sky descriptions of the constellations. We get another reference to the Dipper and Orion, and sort of the thunder clattering and striking in the hills before them. So, in light of this thunder, they sort of stop to take a break, and a man begins to pray. He prays for rain. Almighty God, if it ain't too far out of the way of things in your eternal plan, do you reckon we could have a little rain down here? So yeah, at this point, they're very low on water. It's insanely hot all the time. They just want a little bit of rain. And funnily enough, this man's prayers are answered, because as they ride on, drops of rain the size of grape shot fell upon them out of that wild darkness. So this man's prayers are answered, but unfortunately it's not enough, because they continue to ride through the heat of the day and they're now out of water and their horses are dying, and they eventually leave the desert into the hills where they find a yakal. I looked up the pronunciation for this word. It's essentially a sort of like earthworks hut, a Mexican earthworks hut, and I think it's pronounced yakal, but definitely feel free to prove me wrong if that's not how it's pronounced. But they come across this hut essentially. There's a little creek there. There's a stable. There's a little fence that's sort of been destroyed by the sun. It's cracking. Some really interesting imagery there. So 2 soldiers are sent into this hut to see what's going on. When they come out, they say someone is here because there's hot coals in the hut. This person probably saw that this military company was coming and was like, I'm not going to stay around here to see what happens, because he knows what these sort of military expeditions are for and their goals. So the captain is like, well, if there were people here recently, where did they go? He's sort of looking around. You can see everything for 20 miles around. So he's wondering, well, where are they? We need to go find them. Maybe they have some animals that we can steal, or maybe they've got something good for us. But eventually, 2 men sort of drag this old man out from the stable. He was clearly hiding in the stable from this military company, and he's brought before the captain. And he's obviously quite scared. He puts his hands over his ears and his elbows before his eyes, like one called upon to witness some appalling thing. So this man is like terrified. He knows what's likely going to happen here. And he actually starts to, quote, piss himself. So he's wet his pants. He's before this captain and his whole military company. And the captain's like, get him away from me. He doesn't, he feels sort of disgusted by this person that sits before him, and he's taken away, and in the morning he was gone. So this is essentially, to an extent, what they came to do, which is basically a kind of pillage this land, take whatever they can from these Mexican people, and there's obviously very little concern with how it affects the people who are living on the land already. So they sleep the night at this place by this tank, this water tank that they have. I imagine they refill their canteens and water their horses, and they wake up in the morning, and we get another sunrise description here, of course. But then the captain, he's looking through his telescope, and he spots a herd. He talks to his sergeant. He's not sure what the herd's made up of. He thinks it's horses. They call the Mexican soldier that I talked about before, Candelario, up. He looks through the telescope as well and says, maybe they're horses. And then he gives the telescope back to the captain, who looks up, and we find out that it's basically a massive herd of cattle, mules, and horses, several thousand, and they're moving towards the company. We also learn that with the horde, there's some Native Americans and maybe some Mexicans who are leading this horde of animals. The captain says they're probably just heathen stock thieves. This is sort of what he was talking about in the previous chapter. The Native Americans who he believes have stolen these animals and are committing violence in Mexico. They identify maybe a dozen riders with this horde. And then in quite a sinister way, the captain smiles grimly. We may see a little sport here before the day is out. So he thinks we're probably going to have to fight these guys, but then we can steal their animals, and it's going to be great. Which is super hypocritical, In a sense, the military company is also a heathen horde, really, going across the land, stealing animals. But yeah, the herd gets even closer, and then it eventually arrives. So there's cattle sort of running past them. It's super smoky, remember? We're in this sort of bleak desert-like area. So there's dust being put up. The animals are sort of running past them. And then eventually some of the riders come. And then the man sees on some of the horses that they're painted. He says, already you could see through the dust on the ponies' hides, the painted chevrons, and the hands and rising suns, and birds and fish of every device, like the shade of old work through sizing on a canvas. And now, too, you could hear above the pounding of the unshod hooves the piping of the quena, flutes made from human bones. And some among the company had begun to soar back on their mounts, and some mill in confusion. So it's dusty, there's a lot of confusion. They can now hear these flutes as this sort of massive horde kind of descends upon them. So as they're hearing these flutes and seeing this cattle in this big dust cloud, eventually the ponies that were a part of the herd sort of break off and reveal a horde of mounted lancers and archers bearing shields bedlight with bits of broken mirror glass that cast 1,000 unpierced suns against the eyes of their enemies. What this horde was hiding was essentially this massive contingent of Native Americans who are now descending upon the unprepared, tired, and ill-equipped military company. We get some very vivid descriptions here. A legion of horribles, hundreds in number, half naked or clad in costumes. So we get a description of some of these costumes. There's a guy who has a stovepipe hat, so sort of like one of those tall military hats. There's a guy with an umbrella, which is I don't know how helpful the umbrella is going to be in this sort of weather and battle, but he's got an umbrella. There's also a guy with the armor of a Spanish conquistador, a big sort of like a shiny breastplate. These are Native Americans who have clearly done this before. They've obviously ambushed other military companies and stolen their gear, and they've sort of patched together elements of European clothing like the hat and the breastplate, And they also have some elements, some Native American elements. So they have brightly colored cloth on some of the horses' ears. And then obviously the painted horses that we talked about before. And as the captain sort of sees this horde, he says, "Oh my God." And then a rattling of arrows pass through the company. So they're now being attacked. Arrows are everywhere. It is sort of utter chaos. He describes it as a Mongol horde. Obviously, the Mongols famous for their sort of horse archery and their ability to move quickly and sort of rout enemies. The company is being attacked and they aren't really able to fight back because they're obviously tired, they're dehydrated, they weren't prepared for battle. And this is ultimately an example or a reference to some of the Native American violence that did happen. And it did happen. And I think it is important to talk about that. I think it's also important to realize and seek to understand maybe some of the reasons why this violence did happen. Because, yeah, like I said before, this is not something that is made up to sort of demonize Native Americans. It was used as a tool to demonize Native Americans. These examples of intense violence from various peoples. But ultimately, this is a military company, and this is a battle, and they're fighting a battle. It's very easy to sort of say it's savagery and unhonorable, or dishonorable rather, when you're the one losing. And I think this again comes back to this idea, Captain White's feelings of supremacy and quite clearly racial and white supremacy. He was very dismissive, obviously the Mexican government, and then obviously the native people. Sort of just described them as a rabble, and now he's being met with the reality of some of these Native American peoples and the power that they do wield in their own land on their own terms. The sergeant is sort of being asked to reconsider his whole belief system as he's being attacked by this group of Native Americans. Some sort of parallels as well to, I guess, the Fremen in Dune. Obviously, the Harkonnens, they dismissed the Fremen, had quite a sort of supremacist, Harkonnen supremacist way of thinking, and ultimately it was led to their downfall. That's the danger of this sort of supremacist thinking as well. To sort of maintain this idea of supremacy, cultural supremacy or ethnic supremacy, you have to underestimate and sort of diminish, I guess, in their opinion, the opposing culture. And when you do that, you do so at your own peril, as we are sort of now finding out. The Native Americans, yeah, continue to descend. The kid, his horse is killed, so he falls off his horse. He's already shot his gun, so he has to reload. And this is not the year 2026. It's not just sort of shoot as many shots as you want. This is not an action movie where you have an unlimited magazine. He has this rifle. He's shot his gun. Now he has to reload, and this is quite a process. And as he's reloading, he sees this man next to him, who's been shot by arrows. He sees another man who's also trying to reload with blood coming from his ears. He sees men scalped around him. What the Native Americans have done is they've surrounded them, they've split them up, and now they're just sort of picking them off one by one, like sort of shooting fish in a barrel at this point. And we get some, very sort of vivid descriptions, snatching aloft the bloody wigs and hacking and chopping at the naked bodies, ripping off limbs, heads, gutting the strange white torsos, and holding up great handfuls of viscera, genitals. So this is a very intense violence. And again, I ask us to sort of think critically when we engage with this kind of content. It's important that we do understand that these are things that did happen, but it's also important to understand that this is not something that was prevalent for all Native Americans. And these examples of intense violence were often used to sort of damage perceptions of Native Americans across America. But once again, these things did happen, and that's why I think Cormac McCarthy and this book is so effective, because it attempts to sort of paint a a realistic picture of what life potentially could have been like at this time. And it doesn't shy away from Native American tragedy and Native American violence, but it also doesn't shy away from American violence, which makes up the most of the sort of the violence in this book, and particularly American violence against Native Americans. But eventually, this group of Native Americans have come. They've sort of ripped up this company. They've scalped a bunch of people. They've killed a bunch of people, and then they clattered from sight again. So they disappear. Obviously, these sort of guerrilla tactics are quite effective against this sort of military company, particularly after so long in the desert. It's very easy for the Native Americans to sort of come in and just crush them and rout them. But they go off, and as the dust sort of settles, we get more descriptions of how the dust sort of settles on the scalped heads of some of the soldiers. They lay maimed, like naked monks in the blood-slaked dust, and everywhere the dying groaned and gibbered, and horses lay screaming. And that is the end of the chapter. So, what I think is really interesting, and the most interesting part of this chapter for me, is the pacing. So we get essentially 10 pages of landscape descriptions and descriptions of this company as it sort of moves further into Mexico and becomes even more sort of desperate and tired and thirsty and hot. And then all of a sudden, in this sort of almost explosion, we get this very effective tension as the herd approaches. And we as the reader and also the characters in the book don't fully understand what this herd is. Interestingly, as the herd approached, the captain looked for the Mexican soldier, and the Mexican soldier had disappeared. So maybe Candelario, when he looked through that telescope and he saw the herd, he knew what was going to happen and he fled, which I think is super interesting. But yeah, we get this very slow burn and then this explosion of violence. It's also really interesting to think about what the Mennonite said in relation to how this expedition would go down. If we remember, he said, pray that they stop you at the river. And I think a lot of these soldiers probably wish they were stopped at the river as they're sort of being attacked by this group of Native Americans. The Mennonite also talked about the wrath of God, how it would be awoken if they did go. We get a description of the group of Native Americans like a horde from a hell more horrible yet than the brimstone land of Christian reckoning. So this attack and these attackers are described as a hell even more hellish than the sort of Christian Americans can comprehend. And I think this is more similar to what the Mennonite was talking about with the wrath of God. When you commit violence on a land and a people, you sort of wake the wrath of God. You sort of force these people to defend themselves. And a lot of the time, they're really angry and they are really violent as a result. So I think it's pretty clear that this military company awoke the wrath of God and were sort of smited, like we talked about last time. But that is the end of our chapter 4 analysis. An interesting chapter, like I said, with the slow burn and then the explosion of action, but great to read nonetheless. I will see you in our next episode where we talk about chapter 5. We don't know what happened to the kid. Maybe he was killed. I guess you'll have to come back next time to find out. But thank you for listening and have a terrific week.